Hello and welcome once again to On the Continent, Africa Rising, a production of the Indaba Africa Group. So I was going to make a sort of a primer to talk about the African Union, and I decided to sit back on that for a little bit, maybe do it later, but then I quickly realized that with the visit just a few days ago of the European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and a large contingent, she brought 20 commissioners with her to the African Union in Addis, that this seemed like an apropos time to talk about what the African Union is, what it's not, and some of the challenges that it faces. So for starters, the African Union is not the European Union. That's something we should talk about. And how do we get to where we are today? Well, let's start with the OAU, the Organization for African Unity, founded in 1963, which lasted until 2002 when the African Union took over for it. So the AAU was founded on the concept of Pan-Africanism, and it also talked about the sacrosanct boundaries. In other words, borders cannot change. And then self-reliance was also something important for it. But the real purpose of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, was to end colonialism and to free African nations from the colonial era. So on that, we have a mixed record when it comes to Pan-Africanism and the sanctity of borders, and also self-reliance and ending of colonialism. Arguably, colonialism, the era ended, and the time frame for the creation of the African Union was apropos. The only remaining areas of Africa that remained under colonial rule or foreign rule at that point would be arguably Western Sahara, which of course would cause some issues with some of our Moroccan colleagues who would beg to disagree with that, saying that that is an integral part of Morocco itself. Yet the African Union recognizes the Western Sahara as an entity in its own. So the African Union today has 55 member states. It's a continental-wide body, and its most recent members include South Sudan, which joined in 2011, and Morocco, which joined in 2017. So South Sudan in August of 2011, and Morocco in January of 2017. Both of those joined with a little bit of controversy. South Sudan violated the long-standing premise of the OAU and the AU on the sanctity of national borders. And so its admission involved the breakup of a country. Now, it's not the first, not unprecedented. Ethiopia and Eritrea split many years before that, so that's actually an earlier example of it. But South Sudan was the first instance of this occurring under the AU itself. Morocco's inclusion was interesting because Morocco had long stated it would not be part of the AU. It had left the OAU as a consequence of their position on the Western Sahara. But strangely enough, it rejoined in January 2017, and the issue of Western Sahara remains unresolved to this point. It has not been something that's been dealt with. So, there we have it. Now, one of the challenges of the OAU is that it eventually became known as a dictator's club, because many of the chairpersons who led the organization from rotating from different countries happened to be dictators or totalitarians who had overthrown their own governments and took over their countries or ruled it with an iron fist. So over time, the OAU became known as the Dictators Club and was accused of not really accomplishing much. But arguably, it's one of its main goals, if not its primary goal, for the ending of the colonial era was actually achieved. And we can make the argument that that was largely achieved by 1990 with the independence of Namibia, and possibly by saying in 1994 the first democratic universal elections in South Africa ended the colonial era. That, however, does mean that there are still a few places on the continent that are places that did not achieve their independence or self-determination, and this is in part because of where the OAU and the AU have stood. That includes, of course, Biafra in Nigeria, which fought a very bloody and disastrous war with the capital of Nigeria and did not gain its independence. And then, of course, of the unrecognized countries of Puntland and Somaliland in Somalia, which the AU does not recognize, and nor do many countries around the world. In fact, the majority do not recognize either one of those. So freedom for all Africans, one could argue, has not quite arrived. Self-reliance was a core principle of the Pan-African values of the OAU, and it is something that the African Union also enshrines self-reliance. However, we'll see in this discussion, that's part of why we're talking about the visit of the European Union Commission president and her entourage raised some issues, in particular one about dependence on donors. So self-reliance is really not there. Now, it's interesting that the African Union itself would not exist today were it not for one individual. And who might that be? Strangely enough, it was Muammar Gaddafi, who, as the leader of Libya, envisioned himself, fancied himself as the eventual president of a United States of Africa, another USA. And so at the CERT conference, CERT 1, which was held in Libya, the agreement was reached to transition from the OAU because they had argued that it had largely achieved its goals of freeing Africans from colonialism. And so that agreement was reached. But then at CERT 2, Gaddafi paid the arrears for a couple of dozen countries in Africa who could not vote in the assembly of the OAU because they were in hock. They had not paid their bills. So if you were behind in your payments and your dues, you could not vote. So Gaddafi paid the dues of all those countries so that everyone could vote, so that the African Union would be created, hoping, of course, that he would become the president of the new African Union. Of course, that was not really what happened, and his fate was quite different, as we've seen as events have borne out subsequently. About a decade after the creation of the African Union, he passed away in a violent manner. So, what else can we talk about here? Well, first off, I'd like to say that this is not an anti-AU video. In fact, I'm pro-AU in many respects, but I'm also honest about what the AU is and what it's not. The reason I make this video is massive misperceptions by an awful lot of Africans and many outside the African Union. Let me say up front that the African Union does some amazing things. It has a competent bureaucracy in Addis Ababa, which promulgates policy and development plans and works its budgets and does its best to achieve the goals of the African Union itself. With that said, it's rather difficult to do. For instance, let me give you a good example. A small staff within the Peace Commission at the African Union put together something called 2050 AIM strategy. That's the 2050 African Integrated Maritime Strategy. And it was released back in 2012. That's now 8 years ago. This is an amazing document. It takes a holistic view at maritime security. We're talking about poaching. We're talking about protecting ports, security, counterterrorism, fisheries protections, brown water, blue water. All of this is covered, and it deals with all of Africa. It was quite a forward-thinking and far-reaching holistic document. Yet here we are 8 years later, and although the AU has approved the document, very little of this has ever been implemented. Very little at all. So there's an instance of the AU having great capacity to do amazing things, yet the implementation of it's not there. Now, why would something like 2050 AIM not be implemented? Well, unlike the European Union, which now has a degree of sovereignty, political sovereignty over its member states, and it can dictate or direct what states are supposed to do, the AU lacks that sovereignty. It is a body that still relies on consensus. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. Consensus will force people to be more measured in the decisions they reach, but it also can be a stumbling block to reacting quickly. And that is one of the challenges that the African Union has. So let's talk a little bit about this. So as I said, not an anti-AU, but we need to be honest about what the AU is. It's not the European Union. And that's the biggest misconception that folks have about the AU. They think it's like the European Union. They should sue. Like Brussels, Addis should say something and people should do something. When an event occurs in Africa like coronavirus, well, naturally the AU is the one to resolve this. Well, that's simply not true. States retain their sovereignty, and that, of course, is one of the key points in the Constitutive Act of the AU, which is in conflict. And there's two of the early ones. One of the ones, and I'll read this directly from the AU Constitutive Act, it says that the African Union exists to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of its member states. That's a laudable goal, one which I would support. However, the very next aim says that the purpose of the Union is to accelerate the political and socioeconomic integration of the continent. While I'm okay with the social and economic integration of the continent, as a proponent of the Westphalian system of states and a strong advocate for state sovereignty, I do take issue with the concept of political integration. We've seen challenges with that with Brexit in the European Union and other states that are interested in leaving the European Union, and the degree to which a new body can overtake the sovereignty of its members. And that is one of the key challenges. So the very aims of the AU are in conflict in some respect. So let's continue on. This issue with the European Commission President Ursula von Leyen and her entourage arriving in Addis is tied to the fact that the European Union has taken exception or has made a point that it disagrees with some of the African Union's positions, in particular sexual orientation. That's something that the African Union and the European Union do not agree on at this point. Now, why should that matter? What is the European Union? What do they have to say? Well, the challenge here, of course, is that despite nearly 2 decades of existence, the African Union does not fund itself. Now, the figures that people propose for it are even misleading. Let me explain. So there are three budgets for the African Union. There's the operational budget, then there's the program budget, and the budget for the peace support operations, or the peace fund. The operational budget is what does the day-to-day operations, pays for electricity, pays the salaries, pays for the travel expenses of people who work at the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa or at satellite offices around the continent. So that's what it needs just to operate. This year, it's about 162 million US dollars, I believe. Then there's the program budget. This is the African Union Commission's budget and the African Union's budget to actually plan and execute operations or programs for development around the continent, things that they want to do to integrate the continent, and that's where that comes from. Then there's the peace fund, or the budget for the peace support operations. Now that is funded almost entirely by donors. Very little of that is funded by Africans. But for the budget, currently, 18 years after the African Union began operations as an African Union, still 72% of its budget is provided by donors. Donors provide the vast majority. So this, of course, is the reason why the European Union feels it should have, or some say, or some voice in matters of the African Union. Now, a lot of Africans take exception to that. Who is the European Union to tell us what we should do? Well, that's a fair point. Well, they're your bill payers. They're the ones paying for the existence of the African Union. And it's actually much, much worse than what I've just described. So when it comes to peacekeeping, much of the cost of peacekeeping is borne by external donors, whether it's a direct cash infusion from the Chinese government, which provided $100 million just a couple years ago, or it is bilateral assistance to African Union member states to train their forces, like the United States does under the Africa Contingency Operations Training Assistance Program, ACOTA, or what were previously known as Section 1206, and now Section 333 for security force assistance to help partner nations build their capacity to do peacekeeping. Or the actual payment of operations like the United Nations does for reimbursement for its mission in Somalia, the AU's mission. So the actual cost of what it takes to operate the African Union, the Commission in Addis, its programs across the continent, and the most expensive portion of late, peace operations, is not even borne by Africans. Now, this is an issue that Africans are well aware of, and the Commission is also well aware of. So in 2016 in Kigali, they reached an agreement to come up with an alternate funding mechanism to assume more of the responsibility. Well, that's laudable. I appreciate that the African Union wants to do that. And they bandied about charging for a surcharge on tickets, but tourism companies around the continent argued that this would cripple African tourism. It's a fair argument. And they looked at a value-added tax, and they also looked at a levy on imported goods. Now, the levy on imported goods is a 0.2%. It's a very small levy. But the interesting thing about that is that the goods are being imported, which means that the people shipping it in have to pay a higher duty. Now, they may or may not pass that cost on to consumers in Africa, but the reality is that they're paying it. So while the African Union is now paying a portion of its own operating cost, Africans aren't really paying that cost, are they? You could argue that they are an increased cost, but that isn't always the case. So the importers, the people shipping the things, exporting from abroad into Africa, are the ones actually paying this portion. So what are Africans paying? Well, that's a fair question. So it's an interesting one nonetheless. So those three budgets are paid for almost entirely by external donors. And that, of course, raises the question about why the European Union thinks it may have a voice. So what else do we have to talk about here? So when it comes to the African Union, it's important to make the distinction between the African Union Commission and the African Union itself. The African Union is the entire body, which is composed of the assembly of the member states, and it has a chairperson, which is a rotating member country's head of state. So most recently, just ending yesterday, was Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, was the chairman of the African Union. And people often conflate that with the chairperson or chairman of the African Union Commission, which is based in Addis. And that is the person who's responsible for running the bureaucracy and the planning and the operations of the organization itself. And their authority is a chief executive over those things. So, for instance, some of the responsibilities of the AUC chairperson, in this case, would be Musa Mahamat, who's currently, he was elected in 2017, January 2017, took office in March of 2017 for a 4-year term. And his role is to promote and popularize the AU's objectives, consult and coordinate with key stakeholder member states, and develop partners, work with regional economic communities, things like that. So he doesn't say things and then they automatically happens because he's in charge of the bureaucracy, which is often conflated with the union itself. That's an integral part of the AU, and it makes it possible for the AU to do its operations, but it is not the AU per se. So let's talk about some of these challenges before we wrap up here for the African Union. So specifically, bring my little board over here, see if you can see it. Some of the challenges here. So first, as I mentioned, the AU is not the EU. It relies on consensus, not sovereignty over its member states to get things done. The second is it can be slow to act. Ebola in 2013, 2014 is a good example of that. The African Union was very slow to react. Eventually, the African Union Commission under Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who was the current chairwoman at that time, acted on this beginning in August of 2014. But by then, the crisis had spread throughout the Mana River region in West Africa and was difficult to contain. Nonetheless, the African Union's response, while slow, was very effective and played a large role in ameliorating that crisis. What else do we have here? Overly dependent on donors. I've covered that. 72% of operating expenses, not including the full true cost of peacekeeping, is borne by external donors. And for the budget of the European Union Commission, the African Union Commission, that's from the European Union predominantly. And then peacekeeping operations come from the US and other bilateral partners and even the Chinese. So the AU lacks sovereignty over its member states, and we should not expect it to try to exercise. Widespread misconceptions, and that's what I'm talking about. The AUC is not the AU. It is the bureaucracy of the African Union, and when people expect something from AUDIS, they should not have overly ambitious expectations. And the next thing is that it is not the European Union. It lacks the sovereignty over its member states that a lot of Africans presume or assume that it actually has. Now, before we go, I'll say that one of the things about the AU is it faces challenges. For instance, before the organization of the AU, we had pre-existing regional economic communities, or RECs as they're called, who ostensibly have responsibility for integrating at a regional level. That's the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, Southern African Development Community, East African Community. These organizations and others predated the creation of the African Union. They were there during the OAU, but predated the AU. So their role is one that's supposed to be integral to the AU, but as we saw with the African Standby Force, the standby brigades belong to the regional economic communities, and they take their direction from the RECs, not from Addis Ababa. Now that presents a challenge, and that's just one example. And then also there's the peer review mechanism, something that was created along with NAPAD, the New Economic Plan for African Development. This was a brainchild of Thabo Mbeki, and it is something that is responsible now for the African Union's development plans across the continent. But the peer review mechanism was something that came along with that, and this is an idea that African states judge the performance of other African states. Very few have participated to this point, Ghana as being an exception. They've done it, and they've done well under the peer review mechanism. But these are other complicating factors for the African Union, some of the things it does. So, the African Union, good organization, full of dedicated, hardworking bureaucrats and members, member states who have great interest in African progress, African development. It is a far better organization than its predecessor, the Organization of African Union. Nonetheless, it does face challenges, not the least of which is that it lacks the funding that it needs to accomplish its missions. This year's operating budget, is somewhere just below $700 million US, and they provide only a small portion of that. Also, it is not what many people think it is. So what we need to do when we look at the African Union is have realistic expectations as to what it can and cannot do. Some people say that the African Union gives Africa leverage. I would disagree. It lacks the ability to negotiate treaties for the whole continent. Member states must submit to the agreement. Now, it did negotiate the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and that's an outstanding development, but it lacks capacity, and the AU doesn't have the ability to enforce it. So we'll see what happens there. So there you have it. There's a little rundown, a summary, a bit of a primer based on current events with the European Union chair or European Union Commission president having gone to Addis to build a new strategy for the European Union post-Brexit to work with the African Union. And that is where we sit today. Ameliorate your expectations with the AU, and you will find that it will achieve much of what you hope it does.